let's take a look at an overview of the history of evolutionary theory and the discipline of evolutionary biology. Now, I always want to start by making sure that we have a clear understanding that the concepts of evolutionary biology have been explored, they have been thought about by a very large group of people, and that for as long as we have record of writing, in other words, recorded thoughts of people at the time, what we see is that people have always been trying to explain the world around them, explain the phenomena, explain why there's so much diversity. And in the diversity of life that we see on this planet, they've been trying to explain some of those really strange things that we see, whether that's great big antlers or funny weird feathers on birds or weird behaviors that we see from different organisms across our planet. So we aren't the first, and this isn't a new thing to start to do what I think of as the head tilt with what's going on there, and why are they doing that, and what in the world is happening? Humans seem to have been thinking about these types of things for a long period of time. When we look at the modern theory of evolutionary biology, there are some key people that we need to look at, because their ideas, their conclusions, the thoughts that they were putting together, and the evidence that they used to support those thoughts and conclusions end up still being important today and are still influencing evolutionary biology. Before we get into that list of sort of important people in the development of the discipline of evolutionary biology, I do think it's important that we anchor ourselves in the context. We all live in a context, and that social, economic, historical context that we live in influences what we observe, the conclusions that we make, the data that we can collect. Our paradigms, the context that we live in, influences what we do and how we come to our conclusions. So I don't want to gloss over the idea that the context definitely influenced these individuals. And in a lot of cases, the context actually introduced some limiting factors to what they could possibly ask questions about or conclusions that they could possibly come to. And this idea that the historical context limited what they may have been studying. So when I talk about the context which these people are living in, we're primarily looking at people who were living during the 1700s through the 1800s. This time in science was so amazing. Part of the reason for that is because of technological advances. Now, I know that the light microscope doesn't seem like a big, huge technological advance. Most of us groan when we have to use a light microscope in introductory biology labs. But when the light microscope was developed, people could start to peer inside of cells. They could watch cells doing things in live time, in real time. And that started to bring up a whole lot of questions, and it got people really curious. We also have developments in the disciplines of statistics and mathematical modeling. And I know that we don't necessarily like to think about how intertwined science and math are, but if we don't have the math background to understand the data we're collecting, to analyze the data we're collecting, then we never get to come to conclusions. We also have a lot of advancements in the discipline of chemistry, figuring out those smaller parts, the atoms, how the atoms are bonding, what can be done with those atoms. Everybody was talking to each other at this time. Science never has really occurred in a bubble because we are social creatures and we love to talk about things. Every new development was being shared, was being talked about, but then there was also a lot of ego. So there was a sense for some people to be very protective, very secretive. All of that human emotion and how we behave and what we do factors into the experiments, the conclusions, the developments, this whole field of evolutionary biology. The other thing that we need to note about this time in history is that by the time the 1700s are around, we are steeped as a globe in colonialism. We've had a long time of colonialism affecting everywhere on the planet. The reason why this is important is because with colonialism, we have groups of Europeans going out to different parts of the world and essentially finding and gathering resources and sending those resources home, that has led to a disparity and has led to baggage that we still are coping with and dealing with today. So that initial colonialism, that those initial stages of globalization that we are still coping with and dealing with today, were influencing this time when these individuals were living. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that throughout this time in history, women were not encouraged to participate in anything sciencey or mathematics. There was a very strict social hierarchy. There was a strict set of expectations for what people could and could not do. Not only does this include behaviors and what you could or could not do depending on your economic class, where you were at in that social hierarchy according to your wealth, but also to the roles of men and women in society. So unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of evidence or record of women contributing throughout this time. And that kind of breaks my heart, because I suspect that behind a lot of these male individuals, that there were some pretty smart and intelligent women who may have actually come up with the idea first, but because the society wouldn't hear their voices, they had to run it through the men instead. So we have to keep that in the back of our mind, that these individuals were not necessarily operating on their own. There was a lot of other influences on what they were doing. The other thing that I want us to keep in mind is when we look at people like Darwin and Alfred Wallace, when we look at some of those naturalists who are exploring different parts and going out and poking around in different parts of the planet, the thing that we need to keep in mind is that they didn't travel alone. They often were hiring groups of people who lived in that location. So we see the effects of that aristocratic European people who lived in the location, that disparity playing out even in the fact that they were capable to go to these locations. And if the people who lived there were generous enough to share their knowledge and share how to survive in these places, give them tips, give them ideas and places to look and places to search. So again, we know their name, but we don't know the names of all of those other people that were helping them while they were collecting samples, while they were going to these places and making observations. They weren't doing it alone. The other thing that's happening during this time is we have the Industrial Revolution. And we have so benefited from the Industrial Revolution. But if you were living at that time, you have to remember you're going from a mainly agricultural-based society to this hugely mechanistic society. And that is a really unusual shift. Industrialization, of course, allows us to make a lot more things cheaper, make it faster. So suddenly people have access to simple things, like even things like silverware and plates and clothing that they didn't have access to before. Hopefully you've heard about this idea that maybe you only had one or two pairs of shoes. Like, there was just a very different way of existing. And the Industrial Revolution was really challenging all of that and expanding how people were starting to interact and what they had available and their standard of life. So we have this mechanization, we have cheaper, easier to achieve, or easier to obtain goods and resources. We have a lot of flow. It's super exciting. It's super devastating because we've got this social hierarchy and economic disparities, and it's still really hard to move from one group to another. So if you're born really poor, it's not like you're going to be able to get to this wealthy aristocratic class. So there's a lot of rules in place. It's really just, it is a tumultuous time. The other thing that I love about this time in history is that with industrialization and the accumulation of wealth, we get this ability to afford the role of a naturalist. And what a naturalist does is they walk around and they make observations, they collect samples, they get to do experimentation. And a lot of the naturalists had wealthy funders. They had earls, or they had super wealthy people who would fund their work and fund their experimentation. And the whole point of doing this, if you were a wealthy individual, is that then you could throw these extravagant parties. And I love reading the menus for these extravagant parties. The amount of pheasants, the amount of potatoes, and the recipes, some of them were really gross. I hope I never eat suet pudding, but whatever. They would throw these extravagant parties and have their other wealthy friends over so that they could show off through this naturalist talking about the work that they were doing. And there was this sense of like having intellectual conversation to show that you are better than somebody else. Give them a pineapple, give them a banana, and some really intellectual conversation, and you will make sure that your status is maintained. I mean, it's just so weird. We now don't think of bananas and pineapples as being luxury goods, but wow, at the time, wow. One person that I read about gave out peaches at his coming out party. Everybody got to have a peach. And I just stopped and went, really? Peaches? But that was such a luxury item. So our naturalists were there. They had their own self-serving interests. They were curious and wanted to solve these things and loved the natural world. But the wealthy aristocratic class had some ulterior motives. They weren't necessarily like, yes, we want to figure everything out. They were more interested in maintaining status and wealth, as opposed to really just trying to figure out how the world ticks. Regardless, we get to benefit from this role of a naturalist, because a lot of what these individuals were doing is what helped develop the theory of evolution, and also develop things like chemistry and cellular biology and geology and physics and a lot of the things that we take for granted today. So yes, this time in history has an ugly dark side. We never want to look past that. We want to make sure we're always thinking about that context, because there were a lot of amazing things that were happening as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of these individuals. And one of the first individuals I want to start with is Carl Linnaeus. The reason why we like Linnaeus is because he's a botanist, and I love plants, so I'm a little bit partial to botany. But what Linnaeus started to do is he started to come up with a classification system. This is where we have taxonomy, and we have the 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, eukarya, kingdoms. And then we get down to the smaller level, genus and species. That whole system of classification was really developed by Carl Linnaeus. So it may feel cumbersome. It's definitely had to go through a lot of changes. But thankfully we have a shared system that we still use today for classifying things. It helps us to communicate clearer about similarities and differences, because that's how he came up with this classification system. He was using morphology, shared characteristics, to start to classify things as being closely related or being distantly related. What's been happening in modern botany especially, but in other disciplines as well, is that recent researchers have had to go into the Linnaean system and go, wow, Carl, you classified these 2 species as being closely related, and they are not whatsoever. I know they look similar, but they're so distantly related. Later on this semester, we're going to talk about convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is where we have 2 very distantly related species looking very similar to one another. And that screwed up a lot of our early scientists and naturalists, because they thought if you look similar to one another, you must be closely related. Well, that'd be the equivalent of saying that I'm closely related to every single redhead on the planet. That simply is not true. And so we've been going back and modifying the Linnaean classification system. But we do want to touch base and know that he contributed to that contributed that major concept to biology. The next person is Buffon. And the interesting thing about Buffon, I don't know if you caught this in the lecture slides, he was born the same year as Linnaeus, and they died relatively close to one another, about a decade apart. And when we look at Buffon, he was giving us some interesting conclusions from chemistry and physics. And essentially what he was looking at is he was looking at how species were going to transform in response to environmental change. Now, this is a fundamental concept of evolutionary biology. So we're going to keep touching base with where the species live and how that might have contributed to their adaptations or what we are seeing today. We always want to keep in mind those abiotic, biotic factors, the biomes, and even things like Bergmann's rule. So that's why we touch base with Buffon. Our next individual is Cuvier. Now, Cuvier was a paleontologist. So we've got somebody who is specifically studying fossils, specifically looking for those gaps in the fossil record. And the important thing here is his point of view that it was based on catastrophes. So when we look at the concept of genetic drift is changes in gene frequency due to a random event, due to some kind of awful catastrophe. And we've got this role of randomness. If you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you perish. You don't get to pass on your genes. If you don't happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you do get to pass on your genes. And this is one of the reasons why we see this change in gene frequencies. So we see that concept being introduced with Cuvier. Now with Hutton, we have the key concepts that he focused on of sedimentation and erosion. And of course, when we looked at the law of superposition and we looked at this ability to age fossils, we can see why his work and his perspective, this idea that fossils that are lower, deeper in the sedimentary rock are older and those nearest the top are younger, why that would have been so influential and how that would have continued, how that would have influenced evolutionary biology at the time and continues to influence evolutionary biology today. Our next big person that we need to talk about is Lamarck. And Lamarck is really, he influenced evolutionary biology quite a lot. And he came up with a type of evolution, Lamarckian evolution. When we look at Lamarckian evolution, it is based on this concept of use and disuse. In other words, if you are using something, it's more likely to get passed on to the next generation. This would help to explain why so many individuals in a species look the same, have the same adaptations. If you're not using something, then that something is going to go away. That adaptation, that structure, that feature is going to go away. Again, notice that we're staying focused on morphology at this point in history. So if you are not using it, it's going to disappear. But then why do I have an appendix? Why do I have those little muscles around my hair to make my hair fluff up when I get cold? Well, that seems weird. Why do I have a tailbone? Why do we still see so many structures that stick around, these vestigial structures that don't seem to have any function? So Lamarckian evolution was nice. Like, he was trying to explain why we see consistency within a species, why structures would be lost, why adaptations would be lost. But he kind of got it wrong, and a lot of people like to laugh at him, and I think that that's unfortunate. A classic example is the example of the giraffes. You know, it's this idea of, if I stretch my neck a little bit, I'm going to pass on that slightly longer neck to the next generation, and then they're going to be able to reach more resources so they can stretch even more, and then they are more likely to pass on their stretched neck to the next generation, and after a few generations I get a giraffe. Well, that would be the equivalent of me doing yoga, my kids doing yoga, and then my grandkids doing yoga, and then before you know it, we've got little stringy Gumby children. Like, no, that's not how it works. Especially when we look at the morphology, which I get it, it's weird. In a giraffe, they have 7 cervical vertebrae, and each cervical vertebrae is like huge. It's a big chunk. I have 7 cervical vertebrae here in my neck, and again, very small. So I see where he was trying to explain how you would get this stretching in the bone and why you would get this result in the organism, but he kind of got it a little wrong. I'm going to put some dots here because we need to come back and revisit Lamarckian evolution later on in the semester when we get into molecular genetics and we start to talk about molecular evolution, because it looks like maybe Lamarck got some things right. So put a little star in your notebook, and right next to that, epigenetics, right next to that, molecular evolution, because we want to come back to Lamarck's concepts of use and disuse. We want to come back to Lamarckian evolution and look at it through new eyes with new information and new technology to see what he actually might have gotten right. Granted, he didn't know about these things at the time. So that's kind of the beauty is sometimes we come to conclusions, sometimes we have thoughts and ideas, but we don't have the information to show whether or not they're correct. Sometimes it's going to take hundreds of years to show that those ideas were correct. In the meantime, you might get laughed at, but such is the way with paradigms. So for right now, we're going to look at Lamarckian evolution and go, not really the way how it works. But we're going to revisit that later with a slightly different point of view. Charles Lyell. Now, here's an individual who was really into rocks. He was into geology, and what he started writing was the Principles of Geology, essentially pulling together these volumes explaining geological processes, geological formation. And I know that to a lot of us now, we're like, rocks? Really? Like, that doesn't get me excited. But at the time, this was the first time it was being done, and so it was super, super, super exciting. And the reason why this ends up becoming so important is because when Darwin is traveling on the Beagle, he's going from port to port. And the thing that's being sent to the port so that he could read it was the latest, greatest volume of the Principles of Geology. Now, this would be the equivalent of getting your favorite magazine every month. Like, he was super excited to see what was Charles Lyell talking about now. And the reason why he was so excited was because he was making these observations of earthquakes, of seashells being way up high in the mountains where they shouldn't be, because sea should be down in the water. He was making all of these observations of the geology in different places around the planet and having to try and explain, essentially, And so Lyell's Principles of Geology were really, really helpful because he was making those observations at the same time when Lyell was publishing this. So, again, I know with modern eyes it doesn't seem really exciting and it's really hard to read, mainly because of the way how they wrote things back then. But it was really fundamental and changed a lot of things at the time, sort of that foundational understanding of how our planet works, of the geology of our planet. We take a little sidestep when we talk a little bit about Malthus. And it's weird to talk about Malthus in evolutionary biology until we understand his book that he wrote, and his papers that he wrote about the population explosion in England. The Industrial Revolution and this increase in quality of life meant an increase in the population. So he was living at the time when he was seeing people having lots and lots of children. He saw the pressures on the resources. He saw the pressures on the environment. This is also a time in England, because of the Industrial Revolution, where we're going to have those characteristic London fogs, these huge environmental, essentially catastrophes, where there was so much air pollution. So when the fog came in, coupled with the air pollution, you had a foggy situation where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Now, in the air were all of these toxins, and so it wasn't unusual for a large amount of people to die or start to have long-term chronic respiratory problems. Asthma, that's the baby version of what these people were coping with when this fog would come through. I mean, it was really, really quite horrific. Then we also have at the time this issue that in England, they didn't have official sewer systems until 1848. Until that point, everything was these open troughs in the streets. So you have a lot of bodily waste just everywhere in the environment. I know that movies like to depict this time in history as being very clean, but it wasn't. It was dungy, it was dirty, it was mucky, it was people going down to the shared well together, and sometimes those wells would be close to where the sewer systems were, so we had a lot of infectious disease. We didn't have that discipline of epidemiology, tracing where disease came from yet. All of this is influencing Malthus, and his observations led him to write a pretty scathing set of papers about population and resources, and this idea that when the population grows, it will be limited by the resources. He had a very dark view of what was happening with humanity and what would continue to happen with humanity. The reason why this is important is because both Darwin and Wallace read Malthus's work. They take his conclusions and his ideas and then they apply that to the natural world. And this is where we start to see the idea of survival of the fittest. Only if you are the fittest will you survive. If you do not have the capability to capture resources, if you do not have the ability to maintain your health, you will die. Only those that can maintain their health will pass on their genes to the next generation. Remember, when we talk about the fittest, when we talk about fitness, we have to remember that species specific. And so it's not just enough to make babies and make sure your health is good enough to pass on your genes to the next generation. For a lot of species, including humans, the parents have to maintain their resources for a long period of time until the offspring can make it on their own. So we've got this dependency of the next generation on the parents, which affects this definition of fitness. So all of this gets wrapped up into the theory of evolution. Now, Wallace was working on a theory of evolution. He was a naturalist, and he was traveling, and you'll read about or have read about Wallace in your Into the Jungle chapter. And so you know a little bit about where he was traveling and some of the problems that he encountered. The important thing here to notice is that Wallace took a slightly different point of view and had a different set of evidence when he started coming up with his theory of evolution, how species are related, how adaptations get passed on from one generation to the next, and why we might see structures and adaptations disappear. So in Wallace's life, he had it a little bit rougher than Darwin. His family wasn't quite as wealthy, and he just struggled a little bit more in finding his way and being able to gain a foothold with the scientific community. Wallace was friends with Darwin. When we look at Darwin, we can sort of see Darwin as being a bit of a problem child. It's kind of amazing that he was able to pull it out and make a name for himself and make a career for himself. I mean, those initial stages where he really couldn't quite stick with school, that was really scary for his family, especially considering that his father was a medical doctor and was concerned that his children would not maintain the same social status. And he knew how fragile it was in that social hierarchy to maintain your level. And so that was his main concern for his kids, which is why he put so much pressure on Charles Darwin. But fortunately, Darwin had some good mentors. He had some good friends, and they really are the ones who are able to help him find his way. When he goes on the voyage of the Beagle and he's making these observations, he's putting things together and questioning things. He's writing to Wallace during this time. He's communicating with other scientists, and so he's developing this theory of evolution in the larger social group. Now, when he gets back to England, he doesn't really seem to do much with it. He pursues studying soils. He and his first son discover the plant hormone auxin. You might have heard of auxin in the form of 2,4-D, an herbicide used to kill weeds. That's a synthetic form of the plant hormone auxin. And auxin is hugely important in agriculture. We spray it on strawberries to make them grow really big. They don't get more flavorful, but hey, they look delicious. So Darwin is able to contribute a lot to science as a naturalist, as studying everything else. In the background, he's working with these concepts of survival of the fittest, natural selection. He's working on the theory of evolution, almost kind of secretive. He's talking about it and communicating back and forth with Wallace. So the big question is, why is Wallace known for the theory of evolution, or why isn't the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution? Why do we only know Darwin? And it comes down to one of those classic things that still applies today. Darwin knew the editor of the journal where he wanted to publish in. He gets his work published first. He knew the editor, so his editor streamlines it to get published right away. And there we go. That's history. We don't know it as the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution. We know it as Darwin's theory of evolution. But I hope that you'll change your point of view and understand it wasn't just him. There were a lot of other people, and I do think that Wallace deserves as much credit as Darwin does. When we look at Wallace's data set, it looks like Wallace actually had better data for showing survival of the fittest and natural selection better than what Darwin was using when he was developing or when he published his theory on evolution. So this takes us through sort of that brief overview of the theory of evolution and modern evolutionary biology today. We still use a lot of those tools that Darwin, Wallace, and others were using. We still rely on that concept of natural selection. We still look at the survival of the fittest as being an important driving factor. When we look at changes in a line of descent over time, we're looking at evolution. We know that there is a little bit to this use and disuse part, a little bit to Lamarckian, what Lamarck was on to. Again, we're going to come back to that a little bit later. We know that the phylogenetic tree that Darwin started to come up with, this visual abstract representation to show how species are related, this branching of species, speciation, we know that that was actually a really good tool, and we're still using that today. So we get to phylogenetic tree and tree thinking in a little bit in this class. Hopefully this will become a little bit clearer as to why this tool is so powerful and why it's so helpful for quickly communicating a lot of information about relatedness and about how speciation has happened, how these changes have rolled out over time. So we do have a lot to credit to Darwin. He came up with a lot of great ideas and has been hugely influential. When we look at the models for evolution, during Darwin's time, what a lot of these individuals were adhering to or what they supported was this gradualistic model of evolution, gradualistic model of speciation. In other words, species are going to change slowly over time. So the picture in the lecture slide shows an orange bird. And over time we see this branching where on one branch it starts to become the cream-colored bird, and on the other branch it starts to become the red bird. And that's nice, but the difficulty with the gradualistic model that even people at the time struggled with was this idea that you would have a species that would look very similar to your newer species. So one of the things they couldn't really explain is when you would have an older species, or a species that had been around, the ancestral species that gave rise to the two new species, you would have them hanging around with the two newer species. They couldn't explain that. So the gradualistic model was what they adhered to, but it was really wrong. In modern evolutionary biology, we now have the punctuated equilibrium model. And what this says is that species actually stay the same for a long period of time. This is supported by the fossil record, and it's supported by observations that we're currently making of species existing on this planet. So we find that species actually stay the same for a really long period of time, and that they seem to go through what's considered a relatively quick speciation event. In other words, the new species branches off, the ancestral species could still live side by side with the new species. We see this happen a lot. So when speciation events occur, sometimes the new species looks very different from the original species. And the lecture slides, I give you the example of the North American bluebird and the American robin. I mean, these two species look very different from one another, and yet they are very closely related to one another. Then we have the situation with speciation, where when speciation happens, it is impossible. And I've literally handled hundreds of little flycatchers, and I can't visually tell you the difference between some of those flycatchers, because when the speciation happened, their physical features, their morphology, looks the same. I mean, you could measure, it's called the primary 4 and the primary 5. If one's longer than the other on this one, then it's this species. And if it's shorter, then it's that species. You can measure the length of the tail, and if it's this length or that length. I mean, there are some pretty subtle measurements that we have to take in order to tell the difference between the flycatcher species. And you're not going to be able to do that visually walking around in the woods, but you can do it through sound. The two new species make very different mating calls. And so the way how we can tell the difference between these species, if we're not holding them in our hand and taking all these intricate measurements, is when we are out in the field just listening to them on their breeding territory. Regardless of whether the differences are really dramatic, like in the case of the robin and bluebird, or really subtle, like in the case of the flycatchers, the important thing here is that once speciation has happened, the new species can no longer interbreed and make babies, or at least babies that live. So our flycatchers, both breeding in the same location, absolutely cannot interbreed and make babies, even though they look the same. And then we've got their songs. Their songs are very specific, so a female can't mistake visually and accidentally mate with the wrong species. The songs are double reinforcing to say, no, believe me, I've got a lot of genetic changes. You don't want to mate with me unless you're of my species. Our babies will never make it. So that's our punctuated equilibrium model. Species stay the same for a long period of time. When speciation events happen, they tend to happen fairly quickly, and our old original ancestral species will often be living alongside our new species. The speciation event could be dramatic or it could be very subtle. Regardless, we know that there are significant genetic changes, and those genetic changes mean that our new species can no longer interbreed with our original species. We'll get into more details about this later on this semester. In this lecture, we also have some of those different categories of species. Make sure you get those examples paired with the definition of the examples of species. And then finally, we end this chapter by looking at the morphology and some of those morphological characteristics that we're looking for when we are looking for speciation. We're looking for closeness or similarities or differences between species. So again, get the morphological characteristics, vestigial, homologous, and analogous structures memorized, and make sure you've got lots of examples to go along with it. We'll keep revisiting these concepts throughout the semester. As always, if you have questions, please